Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so happy you could attend. Come inside, come inside. Today we're going to be discussing federal law, primarily federal criminal defense. This is a very specialized area of law, and it's very important that if you are charged in a federal case with any type of a crime, that you get someone who has vast experience in the federal system. There are two ways that you can be defended if you are indigent, if you can't afford your own attorney. One is to be appointed by the court to the Federal Defender's Office. We have a very good Federal Defender's Office in Utah, and some very high quality attorneys practicing there. They get about 75% of all federal cases that are found to be indigent. The next 25% are covered by what are known as CJA attorneys. CJA stands for Criminal Justice Act. It's law that was passed that allowed the federal government to hire private counsel who are versed in federal law and can represent indigent clients. They are paid a very small hourly rate for handling those cases, but they do, generally speaking, a very good job. There is a very strict screening process to get into that system. The CJA panel has attorneys both in Salt Lake and in St. George, Utah, and that covers almost every case. The southern Utah is growing substantially, and we'll talk about some of those changes in southern Utah in the federal system in a little bit. I've been on the panel since 1989, so I've been here for a minute. I've seen a lot of changes through the federal system in my decades of practice in the federal system. Some of them bad, some of them good. In fact, last week I was in Oklahoma for 3 days to handle an Oklahoma case. This is one of those strange circumstances. There was a case that's referred to as McGirt. It is a Supreme Court case that came out a couple of years ago that essentially said that tribal people who live in various areas of Oklahoma, mostly northern and eastern Oklahoma, that are still tribe members, if they are charged with a crime or if a victim is a member of a tribe, those cases must be taken through federal court. So where the federal caseload, before McGirt, there was probably 2 to 3 murder cases handled in the federal system there 2 to 3 years ago. Now they have 30. So the court has authorized anyone in the 10th Circuit CJA panel to assist with those cases, and I've been assigned to 2 of those cases in Oklahoma, to help the Federal Defender's Office in Oklahoma to try to keep up with the caseload. So that's where I spent last week, handling a case where a registered member of a tribe was charged with an assault. And so that was an interesting case, and it's nice to travel and see some of the differences in federal practice in other jurisdictions, but essentially it's all the same. That's what the federal sentencing guidelines were meant to do, is to unify the courts throughout the nation so that certain areas would not be having disparate sentences from one state to another, one area of the country to another. The federal system in criminal law, the government has approximately a 98% conviction rate, and a full 90% or higher of those are done through plea bargain agreements. The reason for this is those federal sentencing guidelines. They're very draconian, they're very stiff. In state court, for example, if you have a possession of an illegal drug that is an amount that is a distributable amount that's not personal use, then you may get a second-degree felony in Utah, maybe a first, but generally a second-degree felony, with a sentence of 1 to 15 years in the state prison, but most of the time folks convicted of that only do perhaps a year in jail, maybe less, and then they're back out there on probation. The few of those cases that get sent to the Utah State Prison are cycled out rapidly so that there's more room in the state prison for violent offenders and sex offenders. So most people who are in the drug world understand that they're probably not going to do a lot of time in state court. If they get caught and convicted, they'll serve maybe a year or two, maybe 3 at the most, then they'll be back out. However, in the federal system, if you have been charged with distribution, you're looking at what's called a mandatory minimum of 10 years. In other words, if you're convicted of that charge, you're supposed to do a decade in jail, 120 months, a decade in prison, 120 months is the standard sentence for someone convicted of that crime in the federal system. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can get below that 10-year minimum mandatory. But even if you do, the court calculates your sentence by the guidelines through a matrix that compares both criminal history and the severity of your crime to come up with a guideline range where the federal judge will start analyzing an appropriate sentence. Those guidelines, if not minimum mandatory, are simply a starting point. Federal judges have the authority now to adjust up or down from those guidelines on the recommendations that are made through those and by both the attorney for the defendant and the attorney for the government, as well as federal probation. The judge is free to sentence someone to whatever they feel is appropriate, as long as it's not over the maximum penalty. But as we discussed, the maximum penalty on many of these drug distribution cases is life in prison. So it's very rare that a judge will go above that maximum. They are probably a full 70% of the kinds of cases we see in southern Utah. We see what are known as pipeline cases. We live right on I-15, and as you know, or may not know, but I'll let you know, I-15 starts in San Diego, California, right on the border. In fact, you can drive I-15 right into Mexico if you go past the border. So it's a giant pipeline. It's a giant interstate highway that is used by many folks who are bringing illegal drugs into the country and through the country. They drive up I-15. They will, at least those coming through southern Utah, either be going towards Denver, and they'll get off on I-70 and start heading east. Again, I-70 begins in Utah, in just just south of Fillmore and just north of Beaver, Utah. Yes, there is a town named Beaver, Utah. Insert your favorite Beaver joke here. Then that I-70 goes west all the way to North Carolina, where it terminates close to the ocean. So that is a major artery. Those who don't want to go the southern route will be going I-15 to I-80. I-80 is branches off in Salt Lake and heads east, and we see a lot of folks that are on their way to Chicago or Detroit or some other major Midwest or eastern city that get stopped on I-80 in these drug pipeline cases. As I indicated, those minimum mandatories are a real shock for many people who have either limited or no experience in the criminal justice system, or what experience they have had is in state courts. And it's always an uncomfortable conversation to let folks know that they're looking at 10 years in prison as a minimum after they get over the shock. And most of my clients, men, women, both, have a little bit of a crying spell as they're told about that. Then they indicate that I must be the worst attorney in the world, and I tell them, no, I'm not. You're in the worst place in the world to get caught with drugs, at least in North America, and explain the difference between state and federal systems. It's quite a shock to think that no matter what your age is, you're going to spend a decade in prison. So those are substantial penalties. Now, drug charges aren't the only ones that have substantial penalties. All federal cases have substantial penalties. Being a convicted felon in possession of a firearm is generally going to get you a fair stint in the federal system as well, or possession of ammunition. And I've had clients that have had their right to bear arms reinstituted in the state in which they have come from, but the feds don't recognize that. I've had clients out of Florida, California, Nevada, other states where they've been able to get their gun rights restored in that state, even though they're a convicted felon. But when they hit the federal system, it doesn't matter to them that the state where you came from allows it. In the federal system, once you're a convicted felon, unless you've received a presidential pardon, you're not going to be able to have a firearm or ammunition. That's also quite a shocker for those folks who are generally, they may have had a run-in with the law when they were young. Most of the folks I see when they're 18 to 25 had some kind of a run-in with the law, had a felony conviction. 20, 30 years later, they've done nothing else. They have no other crimes in their life, but they have firearms for hunting. And a lot of folks in Utah get caught hunting. They run a background check on them when the park ranger or the other officer runs the background and sees there's a felony conviction. Well, welcome to federal court. You're going to prison for 3 to 5 years easily. The other cases that we see here a lot, or at least we did prior to the change in administration, illegal reentry. Someone who's been deported has come back without getting permission. they will be charged with illegal reentry. They generally have a maximum sentence of 2 years unless they have a prior felony conviction, in which case it goes drastically up from there. We had a lot of those cases during the former administration. This new administration, we don't have quite as many. So however you feel about that, that's your opinion, and that's how you think about it. It may be good, it may be bad. I'm not going to comment on that here today. That's just a function of what we're seeing in federal court here in southern Utah. We see a lot of embezzlement cases, a lot of cases where a bookkeeper or some other trusted member of a small business begins to siphon off funding and or sells an interest in a business venture that ends up being classified as a security, and astronomical amounts of money are taken from businesses or investors. We see quite a few of those in southern Utah. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just the retirement community that is here that generally gets taken advantage of, or small businesses that are trusting, and those are a large part of what are prosecuted here in southern Utah. We also have a substantial amount of child porn cases. Most child pornography cases carry at least a minimum mandatory of 5 years. There are three areas of increasing penalties. Possession is that 5-year minimum mandatory. If you are distributing child pornography, it runs in the 10-year range, and if you're producing, then clearly you're looking at multiple decades in prison. And there is some logic to that. Simple possession, albeit of terrible images, is lesser crime than possessing it and distributing it. And of course, those who are producers will face the stiffest penalties of all. And that's logical and appropriate. So we do see a number of those cases as well. There are also what are called traveler cases, where someone travels across state lines to either bring someone underage into Utah for sexual purposes, or they're lured here from another state to engage in sexual activities with minors. Most of what we see on those are simply snares set out by law enforcement, where they think they're talking to the mother of an underage girl or boy, or they think they're chatting directly with an underage girl or boy, and that person says, well, come over to my house, just like the old TV show, and they drive, whoever it is drives across state lines. Since we're close to the border, that's not hard, and then they get nabbed, generally speaking, because they aren't talking to the mother of a child or a child themselves. They're talking to some middle-aged white guy like me, who's a cop, who's pretending that they're that person, and trying to entice them to come here and misbehave. It's punished just as severely as if it was a real victim. That always seemed kind of bad cricket to me, but that's how it's done. So if you have a problem with that, don't chat on the internet with anybody. It's 80% of the time, it's not going to be a real person. It's going to be a cop. Not that cops aren't real people, but they're pretending to be something that they're not. So those are the kind of cases we see also. Again, strict minimum mandatories on those. Judges are very unforgiving on child porn cases, understandably. And they're going to have the roughest time in prison. Anybody who's convicted of a sex offense against a child is not going to have a good time either in the court system or when they get to jail or prison. Some Southern Utah information. When I got here about 15 years ago and opened up my practice in St. George and eventually just came down and stayed because of the lovely weather, and I got sick of shoveling snow up in Salt Lake. There were two federal prosecutors assigned to the office down here. It was a brand new office. Started off with one prosecutor, one assistant U.S. attorney, and then he got one of his friends who was in another office and moved him up here. The first one was Paul Kohler, and the second one was Matt Bell. As is the case with many prosecutors, they get promoted to judge. Paul Kohler is now our magistrate judge here in Southern Utah and doing a fine job. And Matt Bell is now a district court judge in the state system, also doing a fine job. His court is in 5th District up in the Iron County area. They were both fine prosecutors, very reasonable, and I think they've both made pretty good judges. The replacements came in and they added one more, and so there are now 3 assistant U.S. attorneys here, and they're adding a 4th. I think that person's already been approved. We don't know who it is. We're all, of course, gambling over who we think it is. And it's a sport that all attorneys engage in, is who's going to be the next prosecutor, who's going to be the next judge. And we read our tea leaves and make our bets, and it's fun to chat about. Likewise, for the first, I would guess, 13 years that I have been in the St. George area, there was no federal defender's office here. All the cases that were assigned here were assigned to the CJA panel. When I first got here 15 years ago, there were 2 of us. It was myself and one other attorney who had been on the panel for a decade or so, and there weren't a lot of cases, so we didn't see much. But of course, where they start bringing prosecutors in, of course, there's more cases. So as Mr. Kohler and Mr. Bell, now Judge Kohler and Judge Bell, were here, they started grabbing more cases, and of course we had to expand the CJA panel here. Currently has about 6 to 7 members. I can't remember exactly the number. And the Federal Defender's Office has now sent down 2 full-time attorneys to open a St. George office for the Federal Defender's system. And so that same split is going to happen here. 75% of all cases here will be defended by the Federal Defender's Office, one of the 2 attorneys there. Excellent defenders. I know them both. Highly experienced, very capable defenders. And the remaining 25% will be represented by those of us on the CJA panel. which is now expanded too far because there's not enough cases. So I guess we'll be doing more work in Oklahoma than in southern Utah. That's okay too. I enjoy representing anybody, anywhere. I enjoy and feel that it's a calling to be a criminal defense attorney. I feel it's a sacred constitutional duty to make sure that anyone accused, no matter how horrible the accusation, someone has got to stand up for those who are accused. Because as we've seen through DNA and increased accuracy in all cases, the amount of folks that have been convicted of murder and put on death row in this nation, a full 25 to 30% of those people have been exonerated in the last 20 years, which means that they were not guilty, and yet they were going to be murdered by our country, by our state, for crimes they didn't commit. So it's very important that everyone have a quality defense. There are a lot of smart, intelligent, and very good attorneys that are prosecutors and that are judges. And we need just the same amount, if not more intelligent and more dedicated on the side of the defense. The field is not equal. The field is tilted in favor of the government in every jurisdiction, in every state, and throughout the United States. So I find it an honor and a privilege to be one of those Davids fighting against Goliath, and I'm happy to represent those folks I'm representing. And if you're ever in the need of being represented in either state or federal court, even if it's not in southern Utah, call me. I'll be happy to help you or get you to someone who can help you. I thank you for watching. I know it's been a little bit of an extensive video, but I wanted to start giving some longer, more informationally fully packed videos. We'll have one next week. We're going to be talking in the upcoming weeks about DUIs, sex cases, and the ever changing marijuana laws in Utah. We've got some fun stories about that. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it if you've stayed till the end. Please click like, and please join in and subscribe to my very small, minuscule subscription. I'm not making any money off of these. I'm doing this just to get information out and hopefully answer some questions that you guys may have on the federal court system as well as in the state court system, focusing on criminal defense. Thank you so much. We'll see you again in about a week.